Hey everyone, welcome back to House to House, our podcast here at the Bridge Church, where we talk about the questions that matter deeply to our faith, but we can't always get into on a Sunday morning. With us, like always, is our lead pastor, Vince. Vince, how are we doing today?
Doing great, Ben. Great to be here. Thanks for hosting today. Thanks everyone for tuning in again. So glad you're here.
So before we jump in,
Housekeeping.
Just a couple things. Like always,
Take it away.
subscribe, like, comment, do all the things. We are not on Apple Podcasts yet. We're still trying to track down our old RSS feed. We will get it. We will get on there. Thank you guys for being on Spotify and being on YouTube, even though they might not be your, what's the word? Preferred platforms. I like Apple. So
You do?
Yeah, I'm an Apple guy.
Interesting.
I listen to everything on Apple.
Wow.
I like
totally new revelation.
your
into
Spotify,
who you are.
right?
Spotify.
And YouTube.
Sometimes YouTube.
Yeah, I've seen YouTube.
But Apple is cool. Mm-hmm. I saw a thing that was talking about how if you pay for YouTube Premium, which I don't, but it's like actually the best music streaming platform you can ever have because it has every single song that's on YouTube, which is literally like every single song.
That's a lot of songs.
There's a lot that isn't on Spotify. If it's something that's like discontinued or the band doesn't want that album up there anymore.
Oh.
You know what I mean?
Oh, so they can't take stuff down, you mean?
It basically, you're just anything you could find on YouTube, you can just play the audio version.
Yes.
As far as I understand. So there's like all sorts of weird old bands that aren't on Spotify, but their music is on YouTube. So if you pay for YouTube Premium, you can play it as if you were in like a Spotify type app or an Apple Music type app. So instead of talking about anything biblical today,
Let's talk about YouTube.
let's talk about
We're
why.
actually going to debate which platform we should be using.
Yeah, we're
And-
going deeper today by talking about which platform to use.
Oh, gosh.
Deeper into listening platforms.
Over the last couple of weeks, we've been jumping into how to read the Bible.
Yeah.
Kind of a holy habit. Why does it matter? Why do we get into it?
Yeah.
We went through an example last week of what it could look like to how we get through the Bible.
Yeah.
And we're going to continue on this little, I don't know what you call it, series, I guess?
Mini-series, maybe.
Mini-series
Yep.
about reading the Bible. But specifically today, a couple things we're going to cover is how the whole Bible is really one story. Vince wrote how would you say this? A children's ministry album about this. Change it into an adult story as well, or sermon series, basically. He's talked about this a bunch before. So we're going to talk about how the whole story of the Bible is it's just one big story, basically. We're going to talk about translations, and we're going to talk about, what was the other thing? Literature, like how it's written.
The different genres, maybe.
The genres, yes, and how that affects us. So we got a couple things to cover today. Do you think we'll get through it all?
I don't think so. we may not get through all of it.
Yeah,
That's
we'll see.
okay.
We'll see. But let's start with the most important part is the greatest story ever told. What is the greatest story ever told?
Yes.
Tell us more, Vince.
Yeah, so like the backstory of the whole kids thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can share that. The whole. So like Ben said, I'll share more details in a minute, but I've made a bunch of resources over the years. Me and a bunch of people have made a bunch of resources to understand sort of the big picture of how the Bible fits together. By the way, everything we're talking about on this podcast really is something we will talk about on a Sunday morning. Like we said, a lot of times this podcast is about going deeper into stuff we might not cover on a Sunday morning. This kind of thing is the kind of thing we might talk about or will talk about on a Sunday morning, but probably not to this depth, this detailed depth, or at least not this sort of like condensed in. And besides that, we likely won't hit it this year. So it seemed like a wise thing because it's been a couple years since we talked about it on a Sunday morning. But basically, people will get saved, will start coming to church, they'll open the Bible, and they will go, I don't understand what is going on here. Most books, even like a big trilogy or series, like you think Lord of the Rings, you can start reading in Fellowship of the Rings, the first book, and then read The Two Towers, read Return of the King. It takes a long time. It's about as big as the Bible.
Yeah.
But it is one storyline that you're just following straight through. So that's what human beings are used to experiencing when they open a book, is they're used to reading one story. The Bible isn't set up that way. So it gets very, very confusing as to how it all fits together. This is embarrassing to say, but like even after grad school, seminary, 4 years in seminary, deep diving theology, church history, the Bible, every book, deep diving every book. By the time it ended, and I sat down after grad school in my first pastor job to put some resources together, I couldn't have, just from memory, sketched out the entire timeline. Like what happens where, which book talks about which event, how they're connected, which comes first, which comes second, the times in history they happened, the times in history they were written. Like it was not all still super clear in my mind. So when we made all these resources, which I'll share a little bit more about in a second, I had to go back and relearn it all. So, so the goal of all these resources, which we'll share in a minute, is to help you see the big picture of how it all fits together. Because if you sit down to read Obadiah, you're not going to get hardly anything out of it if you don't understand why that book was written, who it was written to, what was going on in the history of God's people. There's a storyline you have to sort of understand first, and then understand how all the pieces fit together.
This is why picking and choosing random spots in the Bible most of the time might not help you, right? If you don't understand this big story timeline that's going on, what's happening, what the context is. And so being able to understand the entire storyline, what part of the Bible you're in, what's the issue people are having with God at the time? Kind of puts all the pieces together so you kind of understand the big takeaways. Yes,
100%. 100%. Maybe even the closest thing that would be like a comparison that not everyone may track with, but is like the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yes,
are you into that?
Yeah, I'm very into Marvel.
You are?
Yes. I love
so
Marvel.
Give people a brief, because that's similar in the sense that there's sort of one central timeline, but there's 1,000 offshoots and side plots. Just explain the Marvel Universe.
Yeah, it starts all the way with pretty much Captain America in I think it's the First World War. And
that's where the timeline starts.
I think that's where the timeline pretty much starts.
Yep.
And if you just watched random
Thor or
the Hulk, just one-off movie, there's going to be little scenes that show up, little secrets, kind of almost, I don't know, say it, just there's things only someone who's read the previous movies or watched the previous movies would understand that's happening in that movie. You can watch it by yourself. You might like the movie by itself.
Yeah.
You might find that Iron Man was super cool and that was a cool win. That was a cool story for him taking out the bad guy. But there's behind the scenes, there's stuff that's unfolding as this main evil character is building up slowly. And all these mini bad characters are just a part of this larger grand scheme of things to kind of take out half the world.
Yes. Great example.
So
there's sort of one central trunk, thousands of branches going off, and it's hours and hours and hours of movies. 40 hours of movies? It's something like that.
I'd probably say
maybe more.
Probably say 70. Yeah.
Maybe 70 hours of movies. Yeah. So sometimes Joe and I will watch a movie and she knows some of it too, and I cannot keep track of anything. I don't know what's going on or who relates to who. And the Bible is kind of similar. There is one central storyline with all these different branches, all these different time periods, all these different genres. So I, like you said, I was a kids pastor. And that's sort of where this all started. Was I wanted to create something to give to families that could help families understand that big story of the Bible. So we wrote essentially an album of songs, telling the story through music. It's maybe the most nerdy Bible project kind of thing I've ever done, but that is free for anybody. And so for podcast watchers, you can go to thebiblealbum.org.
Mm-hmm.
See a very old picture of me, which is a funny picture. It's maybe not that funny. And you can get links to the album to listen to on Spotify. You can get links to some incredibly cheesy music videos of kids acting out these songs. You can get a family devotional with, I think, like a weekly devotional and a coloring book that you can download that all syncs together into this sort of like one bank of resources to help people understand how the whole Bible fits together. It's not formally connected to the Bridge at all. I don't think that website is actually formally connected to the church that I was a part of at the time either. But if you go to thebiblealbum.org, it is still live, and you can listen to all the songs and all that sort of thing. That being said, we're going to spend less time on the music today, probably, and more time on the closest equivalent we've done at the Bridge, where at the Bridge, gosh, this has to be 2 or 3 years ago now, we did a sort of adult version sermon series called The Greatest Story Ever Told. You're good.
Just kick my mic.
You're fine. You're totally fine. It doesn't pick up a lot of the noise, like when you tap it. At least I haven't noticed. But 2 or 3 years ago, we did a sermon series called The Greatest Story Ever Told, where we made a PDF that basically gives an adult version explanation. So I think maybe that's where kind of what we go over today.
Yeah.
Which is also, so the adult version is on our website, thebridgenky.com. If you go to resources and then go to Discover the Bible, you can download this PDF. And watchers, if you want to do this, there is a chart on page 6 that literally shows you the entire 30,000-foot view of the entire Bible. All the events, the books that they are written down in, the timeline in history that the event happened.
Yeah.
And
great.
follow along.
Yeah. So
Is that so confusing? Make sense? Questions? Clarify.
Yeah, clarify. The hope of today's podcast is for us to be able to go walk through quickly these 5 seasons, or if you're on Spotify and you're listening to the songs, about 13 songs, and they're broken up into chunks of time of the Bible chronologically, so that we can understand the main themes, the main ideas about what's happening during these seasons in the Bible, so that we can put all the pieces together to know when I'm reading this part of the Bible, what are some things I should be thinking about when it comes to the context of the story, and how does Jesus play a part in that? Yeah,
the season thing or episode thing, you'll see those terms on the PDF. Those are not actually, like, the Bible is not actually broken down like a TV show. That's just something we did to sort of separate. This is kind of a chunk of time, so we'll call it a season. We'll call this chunk of time a season. So, again, if you read through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, it will not follow the actual timeline of events that we're about to cover. That's why it's so confusing.
Yes.
Is because the books are arranged in the Bible out of order to the actual events that happened.
Why did they do that? Why do you think they organized the books of the Bible that way?
Some of that we will kind of naturally see as we go through this chart. But some of it, who knows?
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure there is some reason, but the Bible is not put together necessarily to like cover it in like a strictly chronological order. But there is a chronological series of events and a central storyline, and all the books sort of like circle their way through it. So anyways, I think main thing probably that would be most helpful for listeners would be to download this PDF. bridgenky.com, resources, discover the Bible, download the PDF, turn to page 6
Yes.
as you watch, and that will help us.
Awesome. Well, let's start at the top. Let's start with what we called season 1 here at the Bridge. You called it A Nation is Born. This covers the creation story, the fall, the flood, and how a family was born. Kind of Genesis 1 through Genesis, I'm trying to remember, 30-ish, probably?
So in this particular chart, sort of season 1 is just all of Genesis.
Oh, all Genesis. Okay.
Yep. If you look
I see that
in
now.
row 5, it says main storyline books. So that row is basically the actual storytelling, like the narrative books are all going to be laid out in that row. Maybe I'll give a quick overview of the chart. Does that sound good?
Sure.
So basically, seasons at the top, little icons to help you know, just a little visual reminder. Episodes, those are main events within that season. Then the main characters, the timeline, those are the years in history when those events happened based on historians' rough estimates. The main storyline books line up perfectly with everything above. So Genesis covers creation, fall, flood, family. In the next season, we can see Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those cover time in Egypt, the Exodus, the wandering, and the law. Then the very last row at the bottom, supporting books, are books that don't actually tell the story, but they relate to the story.
Okay.
So as we go, we'll kind of highlight, here's one of those supporting books, and here is how it relates to that season. And I'm curious, Ben, we should maybe try, you tell me at a glance, like, because you probably know most of this, especially when you see it, right?
A little bit, yeah. I didn't write this. I didn't make this document. So, but
if you were sitting down with someone though,
Yes.
and they were like, "What is season 1? Give us the quick." Using this as a cheat sheet.
if I'm using just using this, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What happens in season 1?
Season 1, God creates everything,
Yeah.
and it was good.
Yes. Yep.
And then something happens. A snake is at the top of the icon. So so the fall happens.
Yeah.
So we sin, or Adam and Eve sin, and we are separated from God.
Yeah.
And things just don't go well. Things don't go ideally. God's upset. He's like, these people can't do anything right, no matter how much advice or I give them.
Yep.
He's like, we need to restart. Noah, the flood happens.
Boom.
Okay?
Yep.
And the flood comes and goes. God promises never do it again. And then he's like, okay, we're going to have someone come eventually, which he also says in Genesis, or early on in Genesis. But, and from your family, the Messiah will be born.
Boom.
Yeah.
That's it. Creation, fall, the flood, aka Noah and the ark. And then God chooses the family of Abram and says, hey, I'm going to take Abram, and your descendants are going to become a great nation. That's why we call it a nation is born. They're going to become a great nation. And from that nation, the world is going to be redeemed. And I'm going to sort of restore all things through your descendants. Make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think if we're just grabbing this little season here, this little section of time, just what do you think when we talk about the creation part of that? What do you think we often miss about God's maybe intent for how things were maybe supposed to go or ideally would have went? I guess we sometimes just quickly go through like Adam and Eve messed up.
Yeah.
Is there anything?
What are you thinking? You got something in mind?
I don't.
Or do you?
No, that's just a question. No answer suggested. No suggested answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe different ways you could take that question, but I mean, there are different people who sort of theorize how much time there was between creation and fall.
Oh, yeah.
And some theologians think that was like a very long time. So, because sometimes it's like, you literally created, and then like next thing it all falls apart. It might not have been the very next thing that happened. But yeah, the point was for it to be perfect and a blissful existence for humanity, and also with meaningful work to do. That's another thing people talk about. You know, they were commanded to fill the earth and subdue it. So there was going to be a beautiful story written without a fall if humanity hadn't sinned. Now this kind of goes back to our Calvinism versus Arminianism episode, right? Did God sovereignly, how much of this did he sovereignly ordain? How much this was left to free will? But yeah, there was going to be a storyline that looked different if it wasn't for human sin. So, creation, fall, the flood, the family. There are tons of other little things that happen in season 1.
Yeah.
There's Cain and Abel. There's Abram, like we just said, but then it goes Abram changes his name to Abraham. He has a kid named Isaac. Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons. That's where we get the story of Joseph. Joseph ends up in Egypt. There's a famine. And then Joseph is ruling in Egypt, and he invites all his brothers and dad to come with them to Egypt, and that's how the Israelites end up in Egypt, was from Joseph. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, no, it all makes, yes. What is the point of season 1 then? Why do we bundle it up this way, I guess? What is the main, if I'm randomly reading the story of Joseph, like you just said, what are some things I should understand about this time of the Bible as I'm reading that story specifically?
Yeah. There's different themes that you can trace straight through the entire Bible. And we could actually tell the story of these 5 seasons through multiple different lenses or like themes. So sacrifice would be one of them. Covenant would be one of them. Just like the promised land itself is another thing, that there's always this like land theme that runs its way through. But maybe for the sake of this episode, we can kind of pay attention to the covenant theme.
Yeah, I think it's helpful.
Yeah, because that is covenant, and maybe just sort of God's plan to redeem the whole world. Because basically, as you work through these different seasons, quote unquote, of the Bible, that is this. If you had to boil it down to anything, it is God's unfolding story of restoring the whole world back to the way it was in the garden. So humanity is placed in the garden, Adam and Eve sin, everything is broken. Then the rest of the story is essentially God putting it back together. So the flood was, in a way, like you said, God kind of resetting, putting it back together. That particular thing didn't actually lead to a good outcome, because like Noah gets off the ark and like gets drunk immediately, and it's like a whole mess right away. But the main sort of God's plan to redeem the world that does trace through the rest of the book is with that family of Abraham. So every other redemptive act that God does through the rest of the Bible can be traced directly back to this one family, the family of Abraham. So we will see the covenant with Abraham. That's in Genesis 15, where he says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. You've heard these verses. I will make your name great. I like to show off the few verses I have memorized whenever I can.
You're funny. I think, I will bless the whole world through your family.
Yeah.
I think something like that, he says?
Yes. Essentially, I will turn your family into a great nation, and the whole world will be blessed through you.
And that's funny, though, because that was at the time when Abraham didn't have any kids yet. And he's much older, right?
Yes. So he gives that promise to Abraham before Isaac is born. Isaac is born to him in Abraham and Sarai's old age. Isaac grows up, has Jacob. Jacob has a bunch of kids. And they end up in Egypt. So yeah, the whole breaking up of the seasons is pretty arbitrary. I did a bunch of research when we made the original kids resources, and different sort of biblical historians broke it up a little differently. Some had sort of 5 main sections. Some would subdivide into 10 main sections. There's different ways to do it. This is just one way to think about it, but it wasn't like I just made it up alone in a room. This is very similar to like what other biblical historians have put together. So all that we just described, creation, fall, flood, family, the calling of Abraham, Abraham's family going into Egypt, that all happens in the book of Genesis. And then as you can see in the final row,
switch documents.
All good. All good.
Job?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So this is one of those side plot things, and we'll just kind of tap on these as we go. Job doesn't directly talk about anything else in the Bible. Right? It doesn't directly relate to Abraham or any other events. It's just this standalone story. But as far as we can tell, based on a few clues, Job likely lived around the same time as Abraham, or maybe even a little bit before. So that's why it's there in the chart. By the way, when you download this PDF, there's quick paragraph descriptions of each book. So we're kind of walking through it chronologically, but if you also want to open up the Bible and find a book, you can just read the paragraph summary of that book in this PDF, and it'll explain to you like what it's about. Especially, I think we did that just for the supporting books. The main storyline books, I think, are sort of apparent, but all the supporting ones, we gave a summary. All right, should we go to season 2?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to think about any takeaways from season 1. A lot of messy families he works with. And
Very messy families.
we probably shouldn't, how do I say it? Probably should we look up to the characters in these? In the Old Testament, there's some major flaws with all these characters.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean there's not things we can learn from it, obviously.
Yeah, that's kind of an ongoing debate as well. Like, when I was in seminary, there was a very strong message of, like, God is the only hero. Jesus is the only hero. And when we read these stories, we should never assume any of them were to look to as an example. Like, there's sort of the storybook, like, have courage like David had, and have strength like Samson had, and have loyalty like Ruth had.
There's a song that I'm thinking of by, who's the guy who was with the tank top? Who's the guy in Nashville? He was singing the song with the tank top that had all the comments.
Oh, just recently.
Yeah.
That was Stephen Furtick and Brandon Lake.
Brandon Lake.
I think
Brandon
Stephen
Lake has
Furtick's
a
in North
song.
Carolina.
Recently, that he's like courage like David, and
Yeah.
all these different how do I say it? Yeah. So, what do you think? Should we? Is that okay? Is that the rest?
I mean, I think there is truth. It is important to know that all these people were very flawed, very sinful, and God used them in spite of those things. So none of them are perfect role models. Jesus is the only perfect role model. However, they are praised. Sometimes I think those people are praised by the Bible. Those people in the Bible are praised by the Bible more than like a lot of seminary professors would. Like, there's the Hall of Faith in Hebrews.
Yes.
It's Hebrews 12 maybe, where it's like a list of all these people talking about their incredible faith and like God calling David a man after his own heart. So I think you just have to it's a little bit of a both hand, right? These people were all very flawed. They all had big failures, but they all did some incredible things and put their faith in God in some very serious ways and can be examples in certain scenarios.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious. That's cool.
Great thought, man. Great thing to bring up.
So
That's season 1.
Season 1, this little family has become a big nation, but now they're living in Egypt, right? As we get into season 2?
Yeah, so season 1 ends with them heading into Egypt. Season 2 starts with them living in Egypt.
Okay.
And we fast forward 400 years. Again, if you're watching, this is not going to make any sense if the PDF is not in front of you. Download this PDF from the website. But you see the timeline row, Ben?
Yeah, 2000 BC,
Yeah.
and then we jump up to 1600 BC pretty quick.
Yes. So they get into Egypt around 2000 BC, and then 400 years later, 1600 BC, they are taken out of Egypt. So they're basically in Egypt, and then at some point they become slaves. The Pharaoh his heart hardens against them. He gets very threatened by the Israelites. They're now called, where does the Israelite thing actually begin? The name Israelites. Yeah, it's because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel. So by this point, they're Israelites in Egypt. So the Pharaoh gets very threatened by the Israelites, and he's like, let's enslave them. Let's treat them harshly. Let's try to get them to stop producing so many children. Eventually, he goes to getting the midwives to try to kill the children, which the midwives don't do. So yeah, basically this is the next big chunk, and a lot of people are familiar with this chunk as well. So again, we went Abraham, Isaac, Jacob's descendants, now living in Egypt. They get delivered out of Egypt by Moses. They wander in the desert for a long time, and in the desert they're given the law of Moses. This is another refreshing of the covenant. So there's the Abrahamic covenant, where it's, Abraham, I'm going to use you and your descendants and your family. And now it's the Mosaic covenant. Moses and the Israelites, if you follow these laws, I will bless you and bless all nations on earth through you.
The covenant's weird in a way. It's cool, but they didn't have like written, like we have contracts now. Mm-hmm. We have contracts that say, if I'll do my job, if you do your job, but if you stop doing your job, I don't have to keep doing my job.
Yeah.
The covenant's not that. The covenant is, even if you mess up, I am still obligated to follow my side of the story, even if you mess up. Didn't they do some weird like walk? They'd walk through. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, yes, I know what you're talking about. I believe that was Abraham, where God actually like cut up the animals in two. Yeah. There's
sorry.
No, that's good. I think I'd have to restudy all that. There is a lot of like, maybe especially in the Calvinist world, there is a lot of like God gave these covenants and they were unbreakable. Like he was going to be faithful no matter how faithless his people were. And there are certain places where God says things like that really do sound like that. Mm-hmm. Then there are also places where it does seem a lot more conditional and it's a lot more like, hey, you kind of can mess this up and I will bail on it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I think it's Hosea at one point. It literally is like, God is like, okay, I'm done with you. And then he kind of like chooses to come back around. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think there's also like, sometimes people really lean into that. And I'm saying this all, I would have to like deep dive into all those passages. But yeah, in general, God is making this covenant and he is staying true to his people through all sorts of failures. Mm-hmm. And that is clear even from this season 2 moment where they're in the desert just being freed from Egypt and they're already disobeying God's commands.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the asking for idols. It's the asking for, why don't we just go back? We were treated better there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go back to Egypt. They worship the golden calf. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then all this season, the time in Egypt, the Exodus out of Egypt, the wandering in the desert, and the law, those are all found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Yeah. And Leviticus is very much just a writing down of that law that they were given. And then Numbers and Deuteronomy is like some history and some law sort of like intertwined with each other. But basically, that's why everyone like jokes. You read Genesis and it's this incredible story. You read Exodus, it's an incredible story. And then you read Leviticus and you're like, what is going on? Because it's all these laws, but it's the law that Moses was given at the time.
The law was written for people to be able to be close to God. Was that the purpose?
Yeah, the essential purpose of the law at the time was described as like, follow these laws so that you will be different than the nations who are living in the promised land.
Okay.
I want you to go in there, live differently, so radically differently than the Canaanite nations living in the promised land, so that they are drawn to me through your example. That's like the sort of the central, it's like God's holy people is a phrase people talk about a lot. Or it's like in the Bible a lot, is God is making this people who are going to be holy, meaning different, set apart, sacred, so that people, and also flourishing, living differently, but then flourishing under God's blessing, so that other nations like want the relationship with God that the Israelites have with God.
Okay.
That's like how it's described.
So they get out of Egypt. They are not, even though God just came through for them, they're still struggling to follow, gives them the laws, hopefully help them be able to follow and stay close to him. And then for the purpose, though, to go and win the promised land almost, because that's our next point, right? Is we're jumping into, hey, let's get the promised land.
Yeah, we're going to send you to the promised land. You're going to be given the promised land. And then I want you to sort of be a city on a hill, right? A light to all nations as you live in the promised land. So season 1, a nation is born. That's in the family of Abraham. Season 2 is the forming of a nation, getting pulled out of slavery, and then being given this new way to live with the law. And then season 3 is our next bet. You should again, unrehearsed, Ben. Unrehearsed. Give your best summary of season 3 using this thing as a. And part of the reason I'm curious to see how that goes is because a lot of Christians who have been in church for a year or 2 or 5 or 10, when they see this chart, a lot of them are like, oh, I've heard all these stories, but I just never could line them all up like this. So maybe you feel a little bit of that. As
Yeah, because I haven't looked at any of these documents until yesterday, or this one specifically a couple minutes before we started talking. So,
so what do you see in season 3?
Season 3, let's look here. Okay. So the Promised Land, which is only the book of Joshua we're talking about right now, right away, is how we go and get it. The failure of a nation, I'm trying to that's what you have it titled as. Or I'm trying to remember. The book of Joshua is less about the strength of the Israelites. It's less about numbers. It's more about trusting God's commands of how to go and take the promised land. And God shows up in big ways when they trust him instead of kind of doing it their own way. Like, we need to have this many men to be able to do it, to be able to take it. No, you don't. Just honestly, pretty much giving the credit to God and trusting him. And even in what seems like a scary situation, and they end up getting the promised land. Book of Judges is after they've acquired the promised land. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
And Judges and I think Ruth, right? Ruth is a supporting story of this part. Okay. So Judges, Ruth, what I'm trying to remember is the main theme of those times.
Or even besides theme, just remember the main storyline?
They quickly fall into like a repeated pattern of rebellion, right? And I think one of the songs that goes with it is called One Big Fail. Is that right?
The kid songs we made, yes.
Because that's what it felt like is, and then the Israelites keep failing over and over again, but God keeps showing up and giving them an opportunity to kind of like try again almost. And so God keeps pursuing them, even though they keep messing up, basically. And it's kind of exhausting. It's like, mess up. God's like, try this way, or here's some grace. I forgive you. Here's some more. Basically try again. And then Kings, the people are like, we want a king to lead us. Someone who's actually here in person, who we can actually see and feel and know that he's real. And the prophets are like, no, you don't. And God's like, just give him a king. It's fine. But then even these people that become anointed all have their failures to show. Even if they seemed great at first, eventually something gets to them and they have their own moral failures or pride failures that kind of show that no human king is ever going to be enough, kind of pointing again to the fact that we need a perfect king in Jesus. So that's how I remember.
That's great, man. So basically they get out of the desert, they get into the promised land, and they being the Israelites, and the big question is essentially, how are they going to do? How are they going to fare? Are they going to obey God or not? You have something you're looking up?
Nope, just follow along.
On that chart, the beefy chart, the beefiest chart. So basically they get in. Joshua's mostly about the war experiences taking over the promised land. And then Judges is that first group of leaders who all have their own various failures, and the Israelites keep rebelling. After the season of the Judges, then we get the kings, Saul, David, and Solomon being the main ones. And those kings, again, have their own failures as well. And what we're sort of seeing unfold is that this plan of I'm going to make this holy nation who sets an example for every other nation isn't going that well. They're just not doing that well obeying, and their leaders aren't doing that well obeying either. So that story, the Promised Land, the ruling of the judges and the ruling of the kings, the first few kings largely happens in those books there: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And again, if you start reading in Genesis, you're not going to, it's not going to go in that exact order: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because interspersed in this area, we get some other books that sort of break that flow. But so Ruth is one of them. That's like a side plot that happens during the time of the judges. And then the other main books related to this time period are Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Are you familiar with how those interweave, relate?
These are some of our, maybe we'll get into this today, I'm not sure, but these are our poetry sections a lot of the poetry sections of the Bible. And I know, but no, tell us more about how we should think about that.
No, that's it. Those are parts of the Bible that, again, like you've got these story-driven books, then you've got some law books like Leviticus, which relate to the story, but they're not going to tell the story itself. Same thing here. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. If you read those, you're not going to hear about David. You're not going to hear about the judges. You're not going to hear about Solomon. But those are poetry and what they would call wisdom books that relate to that same time period, largely because most people believe they were written by those leaders. So Psalms, a bunch of those are written by David. Some are written by some other people, but a bunch are written by David. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are largely tied to Solomon, like the sayings of Solomon or things that Solomon wrote himself. So that's why those books are listed in this season of the Bible.
Great.
4?
Cool. Season 4.
This is the most boring episode of all time.
This is, we got to connect it all for sure.
This is one of those, okay, so let's pause here real quick.
Yeah, let's pause.
Because this is one of those hard things where, like, I don't know. I'm sure there's a better way to teach it. But at some point, you just kind of have to, like, have someone explain it to you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, you got to do the work. You got to listen to it. You got to understand it.
You got to just do the work and, like, look at all of it. It's like if you were going to help someone understand the Marvel universe, you could either just make them watch all the movies, or you would literally have to, like, write out it's Captain America and then whoever.
You'd have to do the timeline.
You just have to do the timeline.
Just like, or Star Wars, if you're a Star Wars fan. Like, yes, if you go and watch the movies and when they were released, you can get it. Like, you have to watch all the movies, or you could rewatch the movies now in the right order.
Yeah.
And that is probably the most helpful thing to do.
Yeah.
Or you can have someone tell you what you need to know.
And there's, like, no other way to do it than just explain it. It's so painfully boring.
It can be boring. It can be. Not in a mean way. It's just, and I think that's why, I don't know what part of the Bible it says. I can't remember it. But it says, meditate on Scripture day and night, constantly, and remind yourself of it. Yeah. Because, and I think the point is because there are pieces of the puzzle you're going to continue to put together over as you read more and more and more and more. And part of the issue of explaining all this right now is kind of like Olivia. Sometimes you just have to read the whole thing. Sometimes you just have to dive in, and it's not going to make sense right away. And then the next time you read that passage, you're going to be like, oh, I get it. Or, oh, I see how that's connected. Or just all these big takeaways. But if you're just trying to get a theme of each one, it's going to be a little harder, I guess. Yeah, I don't know.
It's going to be a little harder. I'm sure there's people who could make it more interesting. than me and maybe us. But at a high level, at some point, you have to just just understand the timeline. And you can either do it the long way, or this would be like the short way, where you just kind of briefly skim over the main events. I mean, it's almost like if someone were to, here's another analogy. If someone were to say, help me understand the history of the United States in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Like, you're just kind of explaining the history of the United States, right?
Yeah.
We were living, in Great Britain.
Yep.
And then a bunch of people left. Then they got mad that we were getting taxed too much.
Yep.
So then we fought, and then we got our freedom, and then we signed the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
Or I guess that was first, and then the war. And then we divided up into, there's no other way to do it than just explain it. And then we fought with each other. Then we had a civil war. It's like, that's basically what we're doing in this chart. It's like basically saying, hey, these are like the big events and what books of the Bible that they are in.
Yeah. So season 4.
Should we go there now?
You
tell me.
The first thing you write is division. What is the division part? Remind us all.
So that icon actually should have been flipped vertically.
Oh, okay.
Because
It's okay.
because Israel, so again, they're living in the promised land. They've had King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and then King Solomon's sons. During that time period, there is growing tension between the North and the South, similar to the United States in the Civil War, and they split into two separate nations, which did not happen in the Civil War, although it could have, right? But it actually did happen with the nation of Israel. They split into two nations, the Northern Kingdom, which is called Israel, previously was all Israel. Now the Northern Kingdom is called Israel, and the Southern Kingdom is called Judah. So that Judah is where the word Jewish comes from. So as time goes on, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But basically, they're split between North and South. And during that time period, we have a Northern king and a Southern king. And their stories of those two kingdoms is largely found in that column there in 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles.
So
what do you remember about that time period? Anything? Anything of note?
I don't think anything of note right now. But so they separate. Do you remember what they separated over? Is it the sons who separated, or was it?
It was Rehoboam and Jeroboam, which I think were generation 1 after Solomon.
So like each son took a half. Is that where? I'm just trying to remember.
I cannot remember.
Okay.
I'm a bad pastor, bad biblical historian. I think it might have been one was his son and the other one wasn't his son. I can't remember.
Okay.
But it was Jeroboam versus Rehoboam, and I cannot remember the detail of what the conflict was about either. But basically, there was a big. I think it was about the places of worship that the northern kingdoms were like, hey, we don't want our people going all the way down to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. We're going to have other places to offer sacrifice. That was part of the tension at some point. That might have been afterward. I can't remember for sure. But basically, there is a split between north and south.
So they divide, and then 350 years later, in 600 BC, our chart tells us that this is when the exile began.
Yeah.
What happened here?
So one thing of note, and this is very important for people understanding the different pieces, the story of the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom we see in that main storyline column, 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles. In the supporting books, just below, we see Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Those were the prophets who wrote during this time period to the northern and or southern kingdoms, telling them you have got to follow God. And you have to obey him, and you have to live according to his commandments, or else he is going to rip you out of the promised land.
Right, because they won't give up their idols during this time specifically. Is that right?
Yes, this is the big. I mean, there was idols during the judges' time and various other times, but this is a big idol time where they're worshiping the gods of the surrounding nations, and the nations that they didn't completely drive out the nations that were living in the promised land. They stayed intermingled.
And they intermingled.
So they're following the false gods, the Baals, that are sort of like floating around still. And at various times, all of one, north or south, was like just following the Baals, like completely bailed on God altogether.
And God was still, some might argue differently, but God was still patient for 350 years while they ignored warning after warning.
So patient.
Like there's 7-ish, 8 prophets-ish, something like that during this time period.
Yeah.
And God's like, warning, 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 please turn back.
So many warnings. Yes.
And they don't. And the exile comes.
Yes. One quick thing we forgot to in season 3. No, my bad. In season 3, that theme of covenant we were talking about, God makes the covenant with Abram, then he makes the covenant with Moses,
yes.
and then he makes the covenant with David.
Oh, okay.
The Davidic covenant, where he says, David, one of your descendants will reign on the throne forever.
Yes.
And that guy's kingdom will never fail, will never fall.
Okay.
So as we're watching all these kings, there's different periods where God will be like, this king blew it, this king blew it, this king blew it, but for the sake of my covenant with David, I'm going to stick it out with them. But yes, eventually we see in the next little piece of season 4, the exile happens.
And so the north is taken by the Assyrians, and the south is taken by the Babylonians. Okay?
Yes.
The south being Judah, the north being Israel.
Yep.
Right? Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yes. And during that time period, the of main events that we have recorded are Daniel. And that's pretty much the only record we have of like story stuff that happens while they are in exile. You remember the story of Daniel? Give the audience a quick recap. Story of Daniel.
He keeps praying when it's outlawed, basically. Ends up in a den of lions. Again, God saves him because Daniel keeps trusting him and following what the laws said he was supposed to do, even though he's in a foreign land. And he was continuing to be courageous and stick to his convictions. And he allowed his faith to be bigger than the fears of the time.
Yep, 100%. So we see God using people even when the nation as a whole has blown it. God's still using people even in exile to point these nations toward himself, which is sort of a weird round kind of sideways fulfillment of the original promises to Abraham and Moses.
I did it again.
Knock yourself in the face. You're all good. Those promises are being fulfilled in a sort of unexpected way in the sense that Israel is still being a light to other nations, even in exile in just some weird ways.
Yeah.
Through the faith of a few courageous individuals. Daniel, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yep, those are big ones.
They're big ones in this as well. We also get some crazy end times prophecy that happens in the book of Daniel that we won't go into today. And then we also get some prophets who write in the time of the exile. Obadiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations. And also the tail end of Jeremiah. Jeremiah technically overlaps between pre and post exile. Remember from our Bible study last week.
Oh, yeah, that was, yeah.
Remember? By Jeremiah chapter 29, he's writing to the people in exile.
Yes.
So it starts pre-exile, but then it overlaps with the exile. I'm actually reading Jeremiah in my personal Devo time.
Nice.
And it literally says Jeremiah was a prophet from Josiah to, I can't remember, Jehoiakim or something. But whatever, he literally went from when they were like doing their best to when they were doing their worst as a people.
Okay.
So season 4, the nation divides. And this is where different people split it up. Like some people take the exile as its own time period, and then the rebuilding as its own, like totally separate seasons. But basically then we get the rebuilding time. You know about this one. Tell us about that one.
I'm just remembering from last week, 70 years happens was it 70 years on both sides? For both people groups?
I think it was 50 to 70.
Okay.
And then there's all sorts of weird hodgepodge where some people stay in exile, and then there are also some people not every single person left the promised land either. So, yeah, but anyway, keep going.
Big idea, though. God brings his people home, however he does it. There's a few stories to talk about that. But they've lost the land, the temple. They're not like, it's not like it's all waiting for them to just take, right?
Temple was destroyed.
Right. It's gone.
Yep. Temple was destroyed in the exile.
They come back in 3 different waves. Is that right? Of people, like a first wave. What were those waves? I don't remember.
I'm going to blank on the details too. But it was...
Is the name Zerubbabel?
Yeah, Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel?
Yeah,
It's a tough one.
Zerubbabel. I think it was Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah. I think were the 3 waves of people that came back from exile to the promised land.
Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel.
They
Yep.
rebuild the temple.
They started rebuilding the temple,
Oh.
yes. Yep.
Um,
And that goes through Ezra and Nehemiah as well.
okay. Uh-huh.
Like Nehemiah, they're still working on rebuilding everything.
I need your help.
All good. I mean, those are the main plot points. They're in exile. They're allowed to come back. Not everybody comes back. Some people stay in exile. Quick side note on that, under that supporting books area, we see Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and Joel. Those are prophets who wrote during this time of rebuilding. But we also see Esther. And Esther was about Jewish people living in exile after other Israelites already gone back. But they were still, not everybody went back to the promised land.
I see.
Some people stayed in the place where they had been exiled. So Esther is a story of her and other Israelite Jewish people who were like still in exile when a lot of people had gone back. But yeah, we basically see the whole rebuilding time period, rebuilding the city wall around Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple. And it is the same sort of running pattern of Israel still is a hot mess.
Yeah.
So they're not doing a great job obeying. Like temple gets re-put back up and they're already, like the very next thing they describe is like them going back to their old ways, not fully following the law. And like Nehemiah is so mad.
And that's the point of the prophets. Because if they were following the law, they wouldn't need the prophets, right?
The prophets are generally showing up saying, you guys are blowing it.
Yep.
Yes. And those books would fall into that category. So go ahead.
Nope. I'm trying to think.
Because we've basically just seen Israel just fail again and again and again.
Why do you
Abraham
think,
failed.
Well, are we supposed to, why do the Israelites, why do these people, why are they so quick to forget? Why do you think? Because it feels, if you read through this and you're just reading this chronologically, it feels super easy to be judgmental, to be like, you guys forget. Don't you just remember what just happened? You know, like how God came through.
Yeah.
But then I think we forget that we just went through 3,500 years of time.
Yeah.
You know, like I think
Yes.
it's easy to read. If you read these 1,000 pages or whatever, what do you think? This is probably 1,000 pages, right?
I mean, it depends on how it's like printed
sure,
or whatever.
But 1,000
yeah.
pages in 4 months. I think you start to forget that this is 3,500 years of time.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to be like, when you're reading, like, these people are idiots. I
Yeah.
would have known better.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have turned away
Yes.
from God. I would have been faithful. Like, God has showed up every single time. Why would I not trust him?
Yep.
And then random circumstance happens in our life, and I'm like, why, God, have you forsaken me? I broke my ankle. You know, whatever it is. You know, like things are hard financially, whatever it might be. I think it's really easy to fall into a trap of like, if I was there, I would have gotten it, because
Yeah.
we see that throughout this timeline, and we also see that in the very short 3 years of Jesus' ministry with his closest friends.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the theme I'm noticing.
100%. Yeah, I agree. It is easy to feel like, why don't they just get it? But then you got to remember, every time they fall away, it's usually over like a generation of time. And we see ourselves and other people, our faith going up and down within one person's lifetime. And it is incredibly common to see faith lost from generation to generation, or regained from generation to generation. So the deeper reason why, we could talk about that, but it definitely rings true to most people's experience of reality when you understand how big the timeline is and that sort of thing. Yeah, totally.
So the rebuild happens. They say there's 400 years of silence. Is that right?
Yep.
Everything goes quiet. No more prophets. No new scripture. God is silent for 400 years. And then that's
Season 5.
Season 5.
Yeah.
One night in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Everything changes, right?
Yeah, you did listen to those songs, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
I tried to.
I love that.
And so here we get into, I don't know, the king has
next
finally
part.
come. I think
Yeah.
that's what the song was. But yeah.
Yeah, so one important thing to note from that transition from season 4 to season 5 is that we leave not on a totally high note because Israel is still not being super great obeying, but we do leave with Israel living in the promised land with a temple and in a place of comparative stability compared to when they were in exile.
Yeah, stability.
Yeah. But during that 400-year period, Rome shows up and takes over and basically takes complete control of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, of Jerusalem, all that sort of thing. So that's a big, massive historical event that just isn't written about in the Bible. I mean, it's written about in the sense that by the time we get to Jesus, that's the setting, and it's very clear Rome is in charge, but we don't see that actually happen. We don't see that described in the Bible, but we know that from history, and then we know it because it's also what's described in the Bible. So, so Jesus shows up, and he essentially fulfills all of these different covenant promises.
Yeah, talk about those.
Yeah, so basically, the first one to Abraham, I'm going to turn your descendants into a great nation that the whole world is going to take note of and be blessed through. So Jesus sort of fulfills that promise because Jesus is a direct descendant of Abraham and starts a new quote-unquote family. This is where there's some debate in Christianity of how many of the promises that God gave to Israel are still true for Israel as a ethnic group today, and how many of those promises have sort of been transferred onto the church.
The people who have placed their faith in Jesus.
Yeah, so Jesus essentially sets up a new kingdom, a new family, a new covenant, where now we enter into a relationship with God through faith in Jesus. A lot of people in this area, for whatever reason, I don't know the full reason, are largely in that the promises to Israel still stand. I don't know what the percentages are in Christianity in general, but it is at least just as sort of strong of a theological position that the promises to Israel have been replaced or sort of redirected to the church. That those promises all point to Jesus, and then Jesus sort of set up the new people, and now those promises about Israel are now sort of put on the church. So anyway, we could go deeper into that at some point. And actually, we may want to do an episode. My pastor friend from just down the street, Stephen Fincher, deeply, deeply researches all that stuff and has some great thoughts on that whole dynamic of how the promises to Israel and whether or not they still apply to Israel.
That's cool. That's
so
very
we
cool.
could have him on at some point.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
He's knows way more than me about that. But so basically Jesus shows up and it is God in a bod. God sends his own son to the planet Earth. Jesus is born in the manger, and he fulfills that promise to Abraham of setting up this family that's going to bless the whole world. And now we fast forward 2,000 years later, and that promise very much has come true, at least numerically, that it's a third of planet Earth believes in Jesus. He is also the in a way, sort of the fulfillment of the Mosaic law. He says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. So he perfectly followed all of the commandments given to Moses and the Israelites. And now we sort of vicariously receive credit for that life when we place our faith in Jesus. He's the fulfillment of the covenant with David, that David is going to have a son who's going to reign on a throne forever, because Jesus was also a direct descendant to David as well. So Jesus is essentially like, and you've been sort of hinting at this all the way through, he is tied back to like so many of these events. The other main thing that Jesus, or one other main thing, is like the sacrificial system, because all throughout this whole story, for the Israelites to stay in right relationship with God, they have to offer sacrifices at the temple, animal sacrifices, to have their sins forgiven. So Jesus is sort of like the once and for all sacrifice to have our sins forgiven. We could have traced that theme of sacrifice all the way through as well, and it all comes down to Jesus. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the story of the life of Jesus, and that's the first like kind of piece of season 5 is Jesus' life. And then the final little slice there is what we have written down. Now I'm dropping stuff. What we have written down of the what we call the church age, and this is what happens after Jesus dies, rises, and ascends into heaven. We get a record of the early church. We see that record in the book of Acts. The book of Acts really takes us to the very end of the timeline that the Bible covers, like storyline wise. And then we do get a few insights into the storyline from the epistles.
Yeah, that's more, we'll probably talk about this in a future episode. It's more discourse, theological arguments, why we should believe what we believe.
The epistles?
Yeah, versus the narrative of the Gospels, the narrative of some of the classic. When you think of the Old Testament, what do you think about for the Exodus? What do you think about for Genesis? Like a story that you're reading. Oh, it's reading through step by step of the story. But then there's discourse, and then there's poetry, which we haven't really talked about, but...
Yeah, totally. So yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts are what you, I think, call narrative books. Story. Just literal story you can read. Then all that, if you're looking at the chart, that big long column, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, blah, 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 blah. Those are letters written by the early church leaders to the churches that are much more teaching, theology, just telling people how they should follow Jesus, how they should live out their Christian faith. So that's kind of the hour-long... For the people watching this or listening while they were driving, they probably caught like none of it. But if you were looking at the chart, I think it will hopefully help make sense of the chart. And I do think for a lot of people, I already said this, but if you grow up in church or if you've just read the Bible at various times or in various pieces, a chart like this can really help just connect all the dots. Oh, I finally get how it all flows, the whole story of the Bible, how it all fits together. Should we give them a break? Be done here. Be done here.
We're gonna be.
Start to wrap.
Let's wrap this
you got
up.
something else? Yeah.
No, not necessarily. I think we'll wrap up. The story of the Bible as a whole, Genesis to Revelation, does tell one big story. What would you say that big story is that we should, when we're reading any book of the Bible, say we are jumping around, but like what should we be taking into account as we're reading the whole book? That's a
good question to ask. I think the main sort of practical question to ask when you open up any book of the Bible is, what is going on with Israel? Because every single book of the Bible is either telling the story of something going on with Israel, God's chosen people, or it's a letter or book written by one of those Israelite leaders, or it's a letter written to the Israelites by a prophet.
Yep.
Everything comes back to the nation of Israel with a few sort of minor bookends. The church age, which size-wise is a very, very small percentage of the timeline of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is this tiny little snippet of the whole like amount of material in the Bible. So but that still very much relates to Israel because it's the church, which is again either born out of the nation of Israel or joined with Israel, depending on how you look at it. And there's obviously a little bit of pre-Israel in Genesis, but by and large, the story of the Bible is the story of God's relationship with the nation of Israel and how God is leading and guiding Israel to be a blessing to the whole world. That essentially through Israel, God's chosen people, he is restoring and redeeming all things and calling all the world back into a relationship with him. So every book of the Bible connects on some level to that one central thing. And that's probably the first question to ask yourself is, what is going on here in connection to God's relationship with Israel? That answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, because it helps us understand what you're reading right now is God warning them? Like, hey, watch out for these things. Come back to me, please. Is God being patient with them? Is God being gracious to them?
Yeah.
Are they being faithful? Are they trusting God when it seems like it would be hard to trust him in that situation? Or I'm just trying to...
Yeah. So like maybe quick little mini case study. If you look at season 4,
okay,
that third column, the supporting books, we have Malachi. So one of the things Malachi talks about is all this stuff on giving. You're not bringing your tithe into the temple.
Oh, sure.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And he's like, literally, bring the tithe into the temple so that I can bless you. Now that, if you know a little bit of biblical understanding, you're going to know like, okay, yeah, the Israelites were... So again, first question, what does that have to do with Israel? Okay, so this is written to Israel, so it doesn't apply to us one-to-one as Christians, but we know God is telling the Israelites to bring their tithe into the temple. That was something they were commanded to do by Moses. Maybe you have enough biblical understanding, you understand that. And so you can read it and go, okay, I get this. The Israelites aren't bringing the tithe in. But if you understand that that happens in the rebuilding era, it has so much more life to it.
What's the more life?
Well, like you think these are the people who just got back from exile and were just watched the temple get rebuilt, right? They just are like, oh my goodness, we're back in the promised land. Oh my goodness, we have a temple again. Like this would be a time where we'd be like, let's contribute to it. We've always been commanded to do this. Our parents got ripped out of the promised land for not obeying the commandments given to Moses, and we just got our brand spanking new temple. And they're like, nah, you know what I mean? So if you like understand the biblical historical events leading up, you just feel the weight of it differently. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's just one little example.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other ones. You can get the basics without understanding that big storyline, but you feel the weight of it so much more if you understand that big storyline, what came before, what's coming next.
And when last week we talked about timeless.
Yeah.
What for that story specifically, timeless, what should we be thinking about when we read a story like that? When we're reading the Old Testament specifically?
Yeah. I'm trying to even think if there's a way to nuance like a deeper insight you might even get in terms of a timeless truth. This is going to be a big oversimplification, but maybe if you didn't know that backstory, that they just got back into the promised land, you could read that and say, oh, it's really easy to not trust God with our finances, with our giving. That's true. It's correct. It's a correct, timeless principle from that passage. If you understand the historical moment, you might lean more into something a little deeper and more specific, that it's very hard to trust God with our finances. even after he just provides in such a major way, right? Even after you have every reason to trust him, and even after you've seen the consequences of disobeying him when it comes to following him, it still is so easy to, just not be fully faithful in some area or whatever. So
That's good.
I think
that
it just gives you a better ability to feel the weight of the moment. When Malachi is like, bring your tithe into the storehouse, he's not just saying that in a random moment in history. He's saying that in a very specific moment in history. And that's some of, just the background for it.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. So we talked a lot. This is a unique episode.
Uniquely boring. Someone's going to leave a comment like, this is my favorite episode ever. I love all this detail.
People will tell me that, and I'll be like, I am happy you enjoyed it.
Yeah. A certain kind of person loves this kind of thing.
Yeah. And
although that kind of person is maybe annoyed that we didn't go into more detail.
Maybe.
More specificity.
Technically, the last thing I'll say, or I want you to tell us about is, technically, the story doesn't finish, right? This is not a closed book. The book is still open in a way because Jesus hasn't returned. The story is still going.
Yeah.
And God is still inviting us to be a part of it, whether we said yes to Jesus or whether we haven't. What does that mean for us if we have placed our faith in Jesus?
Yeah. I think you said it right there, that whole arc of perfection in the Garden of Eden. Humanity breaks the world. God chooses the nation of Israel to have this special relationship with, to point every nation to Israel so that every nation gets pointed back to God. And then in the church age now, for all practical purposes, regardless of where you land theologically, the narrative is now shifted to God is shining his light to the entire world in a practical sense through the church. So it is still that same story of God calling all nations back to following him through a smaller group of people who are in special relationship with him. So that's now Christians. So we still have really the same job God gave to Abraham. I will, bless you so that you can be a blessing, so that all nations on earth can be blessed through you. And now the way that we do that is essentially through the Great Commission that Jesus gave us. When Jesus said, go into all the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, that was the same central idea that we've seen through the entire story of the nation of Israel. We're blessed to be a blessing. We're in relationship with God to bring other people into relationship with God. So we're living out that story still today, and a lot of the same dynamics are there. One, that we should be, doing that directly through evangelism, but also that our witness to a watching world largely depends on how we live out our faith. That Israel was meant to, especially with Israel, it was less evangelism and it was more obey the law of Moses, live this different way that's going to attract people to you and to God. And
real quick. It's funny though. There was less talk about evangelism in the Old Testament, like evangelism being sharing your faith, telling people about God, telling people about. But now, when the New Testament happened, when Jesus came, he died, and he rose again, he told us to tell others about what it looks like to have a relationship with him. That's what we mean when we say evangelism. Telling the story of the gospel. He still tells us to be the salt of the earth. Salt sustains, salt preserves something with its original design. That's kind of the point of this, I think, the imagery of salt. So we're still told to be the salt of the earth, but he also told us to go and tell, which is different than the Old Testament.
That is probably the biggest shift that pre-Jesus and pre-church God's people were the Israelites, and their light to the world was mostly, maybe exclusively, through their own following of God's commandments. In the church age, it is that for Christians that we are a light to the world in the way that we follow God's commandments. And now we're supposed to go on the offensive. Now we're supposed to go out and share that message and spread that message, especially or in conjunction or like driven by the fact that it's now not about becoming Jewish in order to follow God. Not that you could ethnically, but like there was ways that foreigners could come into the Jewish community and offer sacrifices at the temple and sort of like participate in temple worship, right? They couldn't go to all the same lengths. But now the entrance it's not through circumcision and it's not through temple worship. The entrance point to a relation with God now is simple faith in Jesus. So we've been given this message to give to the world and bring people in.
It's accessible to all now.
It's accessible to all in a way that it never was before. And that was a big debate. I think it's Acts 15, where they were like, okay, if someone wants to sign up for this Jesus thing, do they have to get circumcised? Do they have to follow Mosaic law? And there was a decision at the Jerusalem Council to say, no, put your faith in Jesus, follow him, and you're just as in as any Israelite who's following Jesus.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I think that's everything we're going to cover today. Thank you, guys. We did not get into everything we hoped to discuss. I kind of had a feeling that might happen, but we're happy you guys are here, and we'll talk about it on our next episode. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments, please leave them. Vince always responds to everything. If you do have a real question, a real thought that we didn't touch or we blew right past something, please write it down because we probably blew past it. Vince knows. He'll be able to understand what you're asking and be able to answer your question, I'm sure. So we appreciate you guys. We love you guys, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.